Carl Jung once observed a behavior in his most sensitive patients that seemed, on the surface, like coldness, like giving up, like someone had finally broken the empath spirit. But Jung knew better. What he was actually watching was the most powerful psychological transformation a human being can go through, and almost nobody talks about it. You've probably heard the word empath thrown around a lot, the person who feels everything, the one who absorbs other people's pain like a sponge, the one who cries at commercials, stays up at night worrying about people who don't even think about them. Society has this image of the empath as someone permanently overwhelmed, someone beautiful but fragile, someone who will always feel too much. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. There comes a moment, sometimes quietly, sometimes like a storm, when the empath stops absorbing. They go cold, they go quiet, they pull back from the people they used to pour everything into, and everyone around them panics. They call it a breakdown, they call it depression, they call it betrayal. Jung didn't use that word. He called them sensitives, introverted feeling types, people whose psychological apparatus was tuned far beyond the collective norm. But the hidden truth he uncovered applies directly to what we now call the empath, because that detachment isn't a loss. It isn't the empath becoming something less than they were. It is the moment the empath becomes exactly what they were always supposed to be. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why. But to understand why this is a hidden truth, rather than just a psychological observation, you need to understand what Jung discovered about how these sensitive individuals are built. Because the detachment isn't random. It is the direct, inevitable consequence of a very specific way of experiencing the world. The empath's journey doesn't begin with detachment. It begins with absorption. Jung documented this pattern across dozens of patients in his Zurich clinic. These were people who walked into every room and immediately picked up on everything. Who was lying? Who was in pain? Who was pretending to be fine? They felt the emotional atmosphere of a space before a single word was spoken. Jung had a name for this heightened awareness. He described it as the intuitive function operating at full power, a capacity to read what lies beneath the surface of conscious expression. These individuals weren't just sensitive in the emotional sense. They picked up on things most people screen out, micro-expressions, shifts in tone. The small, almost invisible tells that reveal what someone is really feeling beneath their social mask. Consider a composite case profile based on patterns Jung observed repeatedly in clinical settings. A woman enters therapy. She can identify the childhood wounds of strangers within minutes of meeting them. She knows when her closest friends are lying, even when they give her a perfect story. She feels the unspoken tension in family gatherings before anyone opens their mouth. Jung tested this kind of perception carefully. He brought in colleagues, told them nothing, and watched. The accuracy was staggering, not because of anything mystical, but because this person had spent a lifetime paying attention at a level nobody else was paying. Here's the problem with that gift. When you see everything, you absorb everything. These individuals didn't just notice other people's pain. They took it in. They carried it. They metabolized other people's trauma inside their own bodies. Jung borrowed a term from anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl to describe what was happening. He called it participation mystique. It is the state of unconscious identification with another person, where the boundary between self and other blurs. Jung saw it as a universal human experience, but he noted that certain sensitive types were far more prone to falling into it as adults, pulled under by it without realizing what was happening. They don't just feel with you. They feel as you, constantly, without a switch to turn it off. This is why empaths are exhausted. This is why they have trouble sleeping. This is why they often don't know where they end and someone else begins. They have been functioning as the emotional shock absorbers of every relationship, every family system, every workplace they've ever been part of. They absorb what other people can't hold, and they do it quietly, without complaint, because that's what they've always done. But here's what nobody tells you about a shock absorber. When it takes on more than it was built to hold, it doesn't just bend, it breaks. Or in the case of the empath, it shuts down. Jung studied what happens when these sensitive individuals reach their limit. And what he found disturbed him, not because it was dark, but because it was so perfectly logical and yet so completely misunderstood by everyone around them when it happened. The empath snaps, not into anger most of the time, not into chaos. They snap into stillness, a deep, unnerving stillness that the people around them have never seen before. Jung documented this moment across multiple case profiles. A pattern that repeated itself so consistently, he described it as a sudden breakthrough of objective perception, when unconscious contents that had been accumulating for years finally broke through into conscious awareness all at once. Consider a narrative illustration based on this recurring pattern. Someone has spent years being the emotional anchor of a difficult relationship. They have seen the signs of manipulation. Their heightened intuition registered every inconsistency, every contradiction, every red flag. But because empaths tend to lead with compassion, they explained those signs away. They gave the benefit of the doubt again and again. They told themselves the other person would change. They absorbed the pain of the other person's dysfunction and called it love. Then one day, something shifts, a final betrayal, a moment where the evidence becomes impossible to rationalize, and instead of falling apart, the empath goes quiet. Their eyes change, their voice changes. They become, as Jung described it, unnaturally calm. What is actually happening in that moment is something Jung spent years trying to explain. The empath is not shutting down emotionally. They are doing the opposite. They are finally seeing clearly. All of that unconscious perception, all of that data they have been collecting for years without realizing it, suddenly clicks into focus. They see the pattern. They see what was really happening. And they see it with a clarity that is almost terrifying. This connects directly to one of Jung's most important concepts, the shadow. Empaths aren't broken. They're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the part of a person's psyche they refuse to acknowledge. The neediness, the selfishness, the capacity for cruelty they can't admit is there. Jung was clear that shadow integration is a deeply personal, internal task. But what happens in these dynamics is adjacent to that. The sensitive person has been unconsciously absorbing the impact of another person's unacknowledged shadow, serving as the buffer between them and their own darkness. When the sensitive person detaches, they step out of that role, and suddenly that person is face to face with what they had been avoiding. This is why detachment terrifies the people around the empath. It isn't just that they've lost a source of warmth, it's that they've lost the person who was managing their avoidance for them. The empath was, without knowing it, allowing certain people to stay unconscious, and the moment the empath stops playing that role, the whole system destabilizes. Jung observed something fascinating in these cases. When one of these sensitive patients detached, the people who truly cared about them respected it. They might have been confused, they might have asked questions, but they didn't panic, they didn't escalate, they didn't try to manipulate the empath back into the old dynamic. The people who panicked were the ones who had been feeding off the empath's absorption, and Jung noticed that their panic followed a very specific script. Suddenly, this person was cold. Suddenly, the empath was selfish. Suddenly, the empath was the problem in a story they had never authored. Jung had a term for this too. Shadow projection. The very qualities someone refuses to acknowledge in themselves get thrown outward onto the most visible target. And for empaths, that target was almost always them. Because they had spent so long being the one who absorbed, they were now being accused of causing the exact wounds they had spent years trying to heal. Consider a second composite case profile, drawn from the broader pattern Jung documented. This time, a workplace dynamic. A person who was always the one smoothing over tension. The one who sensed when a colleague was about to explode and quietly redirected the energy. The one who covered for people, translated difficult personalities, made meetings survivable. Everyone relied on them without quite knowing why. And the moment they stepped back, stopped managing the atmosphere, the team began to unravel. Not because this person had done anything wrong, but because their presence had been holding a dysfunctional system together. Their withdrawal didn't create the dysfunction. It just made it impossible to ignore anymore. This is what Jung observed repeatedly. Sensitive individuals become the load-bearing walls of systems that should have been condemned long before. And when they step back, the structure falls before it can be rebuilt honestly. This is the dangerous phase of empath detachment, and it has two sides. For the people around the empath, it's dangerous because their source of unconscious enablement has been removed. But for the empath, the danger is different, because this is the phase where the isolation sets in, where they start to wonder if something is wrong with them, where the silence of their own inner world, finally quiet for the first time, feels unfamiliar enough to frighten them. And this is where something unfair happens. The sensitive person, who has spent years absorbing damage that wasn't theirs, begins to absorb this new accusation too. The voice that says, maybe they're right. Maybe I am the cold one. Maybe I am the selfish one. They turn their sensitivity on themselves with the same intensity they turn it on others. And without a clear framework for what they are going through, they mistake their own awakening for a malfunction. This is the moment Jung considered the most psychologically dangerous in the entire transformation. Not the detachment itself, but the gap between when the sensitive person stops absorbing and when they understand why. That in-between space, where old identity has collapsed and new identity hasn't formed yet, is where the most damage can happen. Confusion is an opening, and the people who relied on their absorption know it instinctively. Jung called this the individuation crisis. Individuation is the process of becoming who you actually are, stripped of the identities other people have layered onto you. And for empaths, this process is particularly brutal, because the identity of the one who helps, absorbs, and holds everyone together has been so central to how they move through the world. When they stop doing that, they have to ask a question they have never had time to ask before. Who am I when I am not absorbing someone else? Most people build their sense of self through the roles they play. The helper, the peacemaker, the one who holds it together. When a sensitive person steps back from those roles, even temporarily, the silence can feel like falling, like there is nothing there. Jung said, this was proof the process was working. That emptiness isn't a sign they were nothing without those roles. It's a sign the false self is falling away to make room for something real. This is the hidden truth about empath detachment. It is not a retreat. It is a reconstruction. It is the soul, slowly and sometimes painfully, building itself from the inside out instead of from the outside in. The empath isn't losing their identity. They are finding, maybe for the first time, what their identity actually is when it isn't shaped entirely by the needs of others. And that reconstruction changes everything. Jung believed, based on what he observed in these cases, that a detached, sensitive person is not a diminished one. They are a more effective one, not in a cold or calculated sense, but in the sense that a tool, finally in the right hands, used for the right purpose, becomes extraordinarily precise. Before the shift, they operate in unconscious absorption mode. They feel everything, take on everything, respond from a place of overwhelm. Their perception is extraordinary, but their relationship to it is reactive. Everything gets in. After the shift, the perception doesn't go away. That heightened intuition, that ability to read a room, to sense a lie, to feel the emotional architecture of a relationship, all of that stays fully intact. But the relationship to what they perceive changes completely. They move from unconscious absorption to conscious observation. They see just as clearly. They feel just as deeply. But they no longer take it all in as their own responsibility to carry. Consider a composite profile based on this pattern of transformation. Someone who spent the first half of their adult life being the person everyone called in crisis, the one who stayed on the phone until 3 a.m., the one who rearranged their own life to stabilize someone else's. After their psychological breakthrough, after their period of detachment, they don't stop caring. But they start choosing. They start asking, consciously, is this mine to carry? Is this situation something I can genuinely help? Or is it something I have been recruited into because my presence makes someone else's discomfort more manageable? That question represents an enormous psychological leap. Jung described this shift as the goal of individuation itself, the process of becoming a conscious individual rather than being swept along by other people's currents. The individuated, sensitive person doesn't withdraw from the emotional world. They engage with it from a different position, not as a sponge, as a witness, not as a fixer, as a seer. And here is where the hidden truth about empaths becomes fully visible. Jung wrote in his later work that he believed highly perceptive individuals, those with heightened intuitive function, served a function that most people never consciously understand. They are the ones who see what the collective doesn't want to look at. They feel the tension in systems before those systems break. They sense the lie in narratives that everyone else has agreed to believe. But that gift only becomes useful, only becomes truly powerful, when the empath is no longer drowning in what they perceive. When they can stand in the middle of the storm and observe without being swept away. Detachment is not the end of empathy. It is the beginning of wisdom. Here is something worth sitting with. The people who unsettled you most, not through cruelty but through calm, who made dishonesty feel impossible simply by being present, those people were almost certainly operating from this place. Not detachment as absence, detachment as clarity. They weren't cold, they were complete. Jung believed this explains why so many individuated sensitive types rose into positions of genuine, quiet influence. People are drawn to psychological groundedness, even when they can't name what they're drawn to. This is the moment Jung called the awakening, and it does not look the way people expect. It doesn't come with a dramatic declaration. It doesn't come with a public confrontation or a list of grievances. It comes quietly, usually in a period of solitude, when the empath realizes they have been living someone else's emotional reality for so long that they forgot they had their own. So how do you know whether the detachment you are experiencing or the detachment you have witnessed in someone close to you is a sign of healing or something more worrying? This matters, because not all withdrawal is the same, not all silence is the same. And getting this wrong, either rushing back in before the integration is complete, or staying in isolation so long that it hardens into permanent disconnection, can derail the entire process. Jung's framework offers some clear markers. Healing detachment looks like stillness. It looks like a person who has stopped chasing connection that costs them everything. It looks like someone who can be in the presence of another person's pain without immediately trying to solve it. It looks like a person who has started to rebuild their own interior life, who has found things that matter to them that have nothing to do with being needed. There is a quality of quiet dignity in healing detachment, a groundedness that feels new, but also, in some strange way, like coming home. The detachment to be concerned about is different. It looks like numbness rather than stillness. It looks like someone who has stopped feeling altogether, not just stopped over-absorbing. It looks like someone who has shut the door not just on the people who hurt them, but on the possibility of connection entirely. It looks like someone who has confused isolation with safety and withdrawal with strength. Jung was very clear about the difference. True individuation, true awakening, doesn't seal you off from the world. It gives you the stability to engage with the world without being destroyed by it. The awakened empath isn't someone who stops loving. They are someone who finally loves with boundaries, who finally chooses depth over constant availability, who finally stops measuring their worth by how much they can absorb. There is also a shift in how they use their perception. Before the detachment, the empath's perception was often turned outward entirely. They were always scanning other people, always reading the room, always monitoring the emotional temperature of the people around them. After the awakening, that perception begins to turn inward as well. They start to apply that extraordinary sensitivity to their own interior experience. They start to notice their own emotions, their own needs, their own patterns, with the same clarity they once directed entirely at others. And when that happens, everything changes. Because now the empath isn't just a reader of other people's stories. They become the author of their own. Jung observed something in his patients who reached this stage that he found both beautiful and quietly revolutionary. These individuals didn't disappear from the people who needed them. They became more effective, not less. Their help became precise instead of reflexive. They could walk into a situation, understand exactly what was happening beneath the surface, and offer exactly what was needed, without losing themselves in the process. They stopped being the person everyone leaned on until they collapsed. They became the person who showed others how to stand. He also observed something else. These individuated patients had a particular effect on the toxic dynamics around them. They didn't have to fight. They simply stopped performing the role the system required of them. When they stopped, the system had to reorganize around their absence. The people who genuinely cared adapted. The people who had been exploiting them, often without conscious awareness, revealed themselves through how they responded to the loss. An empath who has reached their awakening becomes what Jung called a living mirror. Not because they hold up a reflection to shame or expose, but because their clarity, their groundedness, their refusal to collude with unconsciousness makes unconscious behavior visible simply by contrast. You can't gaslight someone who trusts their own perception completely. You can't manipulate someone who is no longer looking for your approval. You can't colonize someone who has already returned to themselves. This is why the world needs empaths who have learned to walk away. Not empaths who have become cold or disconnected, but empaths who have done the hard work of individuation, who have sat with the discomfort of their own unfiltered inner world, who have chosen consciously how to use the extraordinary gift they were born with, because the alternative, an empath who never reaches this stage, is someone whose gift becomes a wound, someone whose capacity to see and feel becomes a liability instead of a superpower, someone who keeps absorbing until there is nothing left of them, and the world doesn't need more of those. The world has always had plenty of people who burn themselves down trying to keep others warm. What Jung believed, and what his clinical patterns consistently demonstrated, is that these sensitive individuals aren't here to be martyrs. They are here to be seers, to feel the things that systems and families would rather ignore, to name the shadows that everyone else has agreed to pretend aren't there. But that function, that sacred, difficult, necessary function, can only be fulfilled by an empath who is intact, who has done their own individuation work, who has learned the difference between empathy and self-erasure. The view detachment that looks like coldness from the outside is, from the inside, the experience of finally having ground beneath your feet, of finally being able to breathe, of finally hearing your own voice after years of listening to everyone else's, of realizing that you were so busy feeling the weight of the world that you forgot you had a life of your own that had been quietly waiting for you. If you have gone through this, if you have reached that quiet, still sometimes lonely place where you stopped absorbing and started observing, know this: you are not broken, you are not cold, you are not giving up on love or connection or the people who matter to you. You are becoming, you are moving from suffering into conscious wisdom. You are completing the transition Jung spent decades documenting, the one that transforms the sensitive person from an unconscious absorber into something rarer and far more powerful. A person who can feel everything, choose everything, and still be standing at the end of it. The world doesn't need you to keep absorbing until you disappear. The world needs you whole, grounded, clear-eyed, and finally, in full possession of the gift you were born with. That is the hidden truth about empaths. Detachment isn't the death of sensitivity. It's the moment sensitivity finally learns to serve the one who carries it. And that changes every life you touch. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.